Abandoned on the ice, a child faces the relentless force of nature alone. On the horizon, a polar bear appears, transforming fear into something unexpected. The biting wind howled across the vast expanse of ice, its relentless gusts the only sound breaking the eerie silence of the tundra. In this desolate landscape, a small figure huddled against the biting cold. Emily, just 9 years old, abandoned and defenseless in a world of white. Her mind raced, replaying the cold words of Dr. Thompson, the millionaire who had left her here. "This will make you stronger," he had said, his voice devoid of emotion. "It's all part of the experiment." Those words echoed in her head, a cruel reminder of the selfish ambition that had brought her to this icy hell. Emily's feet sank into the snow with each step, the frigid air stinging her lungs as she fought to keep moving. Her thin jacket offered little protection against the elements, and the wind seemed to cut right through her. She rubbed her hands together frantically, desperate to generate even the slightest bit of warmth. As the hours crawled by, hunger gnawed at her insides and thirst parched her throat. In a desperate attempt to quench her thirst, Emily scooped up handfuls of snow, letting it melt in her mouth. The icy water did little to satisfy her, but it was all she had. The grey sky began to darken, bringing with it a new wave of terror. Night in the tundra transformed the already hostile environment into something straight out of a nightmare. Shadows stretched across the snow, creating grotesque shapes that seemed to move in the corner of her eye. Emily tried to find shelter, huddling between snowdrifts in a feeble attempt to escape the wind. Her teeth chattered uncontrollably, and she wrapped her arms tightly around herself, trying to conserve what little body heat remained. As she lay there, shivering and alone, a sound different from the howling wind caught her attention. It was rhythmic and heavy, a stark contrast to the continuous gale. Emily's heart raced as she slowly raised her head, straining to identify the source of the noise. Through the swirling snow, a massive silhouette began to take shape on the horizon. Fear gripped her initially, but as the figure came into focus, her terror gave way to awe. A polar bear, majestic and powerful, moved slowly across the tundra. The bear's dark eyes met Emily's for a brief moment, seeming to peer into her very soul. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the animal turned away, continuing its journey across the frozen wasteland. Without any other options and feeling that she wouldn't survive alone, Emily made a split-second decision. She would follow the bear. It was crazy, she knew, but something about the animal's confident stride gave her hope. If anyone knew how to survive in this unforgiving environment, it was this creature. Keeping a safe distance, Emily began to trail the polar bear. She watched intently as it moved, noting how it would occasionally stop to sniff the air or dig in the snow. With each passing moment, she found herself unconsciously mimicking its movements, learning the unspoken language of survival in the Arctic. As Emily focused on following the bear, she was unaware of the eyes watching her every move. Miles away, in a state-of-the-art control room, Dr. Thompson sat surrounded by monitors. His experiment was proceeding as planned, or so he thought. He watched Emily with a mixture of scientific curiosity and something else, a flicker of doubt that he quickly pushed aside. The cameras hidden throughout the tundra provided him with a bird's-eye view of Emily's struggle. He made notes, recording her reactions, her decisions, every minute detail of her fight for survival. This was groundbreaking research, he told himself. The data he was collecting would revolutionize our understanding of human resilience. But as night fell and the temperature dropped even further, an unexpected complication arose. A severe snowstorm began to rage across the tundra, interfering with the signal from several of the hidden cameras. Dr. Thompson leaned forward, his brow furrowed in concern as portions of his video feed turned to static. "No, no, no," he muttered, frantically typing commands into his computer. But it was no use. The storm had damaged some of his equipment, leaving blind spots in his carefully constructed observation grid. For the first time since the experiment began, Dr. Thompson felt a twinge of real fear. He had lost sight of Emily. The situation was spiraling out of his control, becoming unpredictable. Could he still retrieve the girl in time? The question echoed in his mind as he stared at the snowy screens before him. Meanwhile, oblivious to the technological drama unfolding miles away, Emily continued to follow the polar bear. The animal moved with purpose, seeming to know exactly where it was going, despite the worsening weather conditions. As the storm intensified, Emily found it increasingly difficult to keep up. The wind howled louder than ever, driving snow and ice into her face. She could barely see a few feet in front of her, and the bear was becoming harder and harder to track. Just when she thought she would lose sight of her guide completely, Emily stumbled upon a small ice formation. It wasn't much, but it provided some shelter from the relentless wind. Exhausted and shivering uncontrollably, she curled up in the lee of the ice, praying for the storm to pass. As she huddled there, Emily's thoughts drifted to the home she had left behind. She thought of her parents, wondering if they knew where she was, if they were looking for her. A tear froze on her cheek as she remembered the warmth of her bed, the smell of her mother's cooking, the sound of her father's laughter. But dwelling on those memories only made her current situation more unbearable. Emily forced herself to focus on the present, on survival. She thought about the bear, about how it moved and behaved. There were lessons there, she realized. Lessons that could keep her alive. With renewed determination, Emily began to plan. When the storm passed, she would continue following the bear. She would learn from it, adapt to this harsh environment just as it had. And somehow, some way, she would find her way back home. As the long Arctic night wore on, Emily drifted in and out of a fitful sleep. Her dreams were a confused jumble of polar bears, swirling snow, and the cold, calculating face of Dr. Thompson. Through it all, a small spark of hope remained alive in her heart, fueling her will to survive. Little did Emily know that her journey was just beginning. The tundra held many more challenges, and her unlikely alliance with the polar bear would be tested in ways she could never have imagined. As the first hints of dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, Emily stirred, ready to face whatever the new day might bring. The storm was beginning to subside, and in the distance she could just make out the lumbering form of the polar bear. Taking a deep breath, Emily emerged from her makeshift shelter. It was time to move on, to continue her fight for survival in this frozen wasteland. With one last look at the ice formation that had protected her through the night, she set off, following the tracks of her unlikely guardian into the unknown. As the pale Arctic sun crept above the horizon, casting long shadows across the snow-covered landscape, Emily emerged from her icy shelter. Her limbs were stiff from the cold, and her stomach growled with hunger, but a newfound determination burned in her eyes. She squinted against the glare of sunlight on snow, searching for any sign of the polar bear that had unknowingly become her guide. In the distance, she spotted a large white form moving slowly across the tundra. Relief washed over her as she realized the bear hadn't wandered too far during the night. Taking a deep breath of the frigid air, Emily set off, her small feet leaving a trail of footprints in the freshly fallen snow. As she walked, Emily's mind drifted to thoughts of Dr. Thompson and his cruel experiment. She couldn't understand why anyone would do this to a child. The anger and confusion threatened to overwhelm her, but she pushed those feelings aside. Right now, survival was all that mattered. The polar bear moved with purpose, occasionally stopping to sniff the air or dig in the snow. Emily watched intently, trying to decipher the animal's behavior. When the bear paused to investigate a particular spot, Emily cautiously approached the area after it moved on. To her surprise, she found a small hole in the ice, likely created by a seal for breathing. Remembering a nature documentary she had once watched, Emily realized the bear was hunting. She knelt by the hole, cupping her hands to scoop up some of the salty water. It wasn't fresh, but it helped to quench her thirst a little. As the day wore on, Emily continued to follow the bear at a safe distance. She observed how it conserved energy, moving slowly but steadily across the ice. When the wind picked up, the bear would turn its back to the gust, hunching down slightly to minimize exposure. Emily mimicked this behavior, finding that it indeed helped her stay a little warmer. Miles away, in his high-tech control room, Dr. Thompson frantically worked to restore his damaged surveillance system. The snowstorm had knocked out several cameras, leaving significant blind spots in his observation grid. As he tapped away at his keyboard, a mixture of frustration and worry etched across his face. Come on, he muttered, his eyes darting between screens. Finally, after hours of effort, he managed to bring a few more cameras online. But the relief was short-lived as he realized he still couldn't locate Emily. Dr. Thompson leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his graying hair. For the first time since the experiment began, doubt crept into his mind. Was he going too far? Had he underestimated the dangers of the tundra? He quickly shook off these thoughts. No, he told himself, this was for the greater good. The data he would collect would be invaluable. Back on the ice, Emily's focus remained on the polar bear. As the sun began to dip towards the horizon once more, she noticed the animal's pace slowing. It seemed to be searching for something, its nose twitching as it sniffed the air. Suddenly, the bear veered off course, heading towards a cluster of large ice formations. Emily hesitated for a moment before following. As she drew closer, she realized these weren't just random ice structures. They formed a sort of natural igloo. The bear lumbered into the icy shelter, and Emily held her breath, unsure of what to do. After a few moments of internal debate, she decided to risk getting a little closer. Peering around the entrance, she saw the bear settling down for the night, curling up on the icy floor. Emily's heart raced as she considered her options. The igloo-like structure would provide much better shelter than anything she had found so far. But could she risk sleeping so close to a wild animal? As the temperature began to drop and the wind picked up once more, she realized she didn't have much choice. Moving as quietly as she could, Emily slipped into the icy shelter. She pressed herself against the far wall, as far from the bear as possible, while still benefiting from the protection of the ice formations. To her surprise, the bear barely reacted to her presence, merely raising its head to look at her before settling back down. As night fell, Emily huddled in her corner of the ice shelter, watching the steady rise and fall of the bear's breathing. Despite her fear, there was something comforting about not being alone in the vast, frozen wilderness. She found herself drifting off to sleep, lulled by the rhythmic sound of the bear's breath and the muffled howl of the wind outside. Throughout the night, Emily's sleep was fitful. She dreamed of home, of warm beds and hot meals. But she also dreamed of ice and snow, of Dr. Thompson's cold eyes watching her through hidden cameras. Several times she woke with a start, momentarily panicked by the unfamiliar surroundings before remembering where she was. Each time she woke, her eyes would immediately seek out the bear. Its massive form, visible even in the dim light of the Arctic night, provided an odd sense of security. Emily found herself wondering if the bear was aware of her presence, if it somehow understood that they were both trying to survive in this harsh environment. As dawn approached, Emily was awoken by movement. The bear was stirring, preparing to leave the shelter. Without thinking, she scrambled to her feet, ready to follow. But as she moved, her foot slipped on the icy floor, and she let out a small yelp of surprise. The bear's head whipped around, its dark eyes fixed on Emily. For a heart-stopping moment, they stared at each other. Emily held her breath, her heart pounding in her chest. She had never felt so small, so vulnerable. But then, to her amazement, the bear simply turned away and continued out of the shelter. It paused at the entrance, looking back at Emily as if waiting for her. Stunned by this behavior, Emily hesitated for a moment before following. As they emerged into the pale light of the Arctic morning, Emily felt a shift in her relationship with the bear. It wasn't exactly companionship. The bear was still a wild animal after all, but there was a sort of unspoken understanding between them. They were two living beings facing the same harsh reality, each in their own way. With renewed determination, Emily set off after the bear, ready to face whatever challenges the day might bring. She had survived another night in the tundra, and while she was still cold, hungry, and afraid, she also felt a glimmer of hope. If she could learn from the bear, adapt to this unforgiving environment, maybe she had a chance of surviving long enough to be rescued. As they trudged across the snow-covered landscape, Emily's mind turned to Dr. Thompson once again. She wondered if he was watching her now, if he could see how she was learning to survive. A part of her wanted to prove him wrong, to show that she was stronger than he thought. But another part of her just wanted to go home, to escape this icy prison and never see Dr. Thompson again. Little did Emily know that far away, Dr. Thompson was growing increasingly desperate. His experiment was spiraling out of control, and he was beginning to realize the true magnitude of what he had done. As Emily and her unlikely companion ventured further into the tundra, events were unfolding that would soon change everything. The sun climbed higher in the sky, casting a glittering light across the endless expanse of ice and snow. Emily squared her shoulders and pressed on, following the bear into the unknown. Whatever lay ahead, she was determined to face it with the same quiet strength and resilience she had observed in her unexpected guide. The vast tundra stretched out before Emily, an endless sea of white broken only by the occasional jagged ice formation or windswept snowdrift. She had lost track of how many days had passed since Dr. Thompson had left her in this frozen wasteland. Time seemed to blur in the constant daylight of the Arctic summer, with only her growing hunger and fatigue marking the passage of hours. Emily's unlikely companion, the polar bear, lumbered ahead of her with steady determination. She had begun to notice patterns in its behavior, how it would pause occasionally to test the air with its sensitive nose, or how it would alter its course slightly to avoid areas where the ice looked thin. Without realizing it, Emily had started to mimic these behaviors, her survival instincts sharpening with each passing day. As they crested a small ridge, Emily's eyes widened in surprise. Spread out before them was a sprawling field of sea ice, dotted with dark spots that she quickly realized were seals basking in the weak sunlight. The bear's posture changed immediately, its movements becoming more deliberate and cautious. Emily watched in fascination as the bear began to stalk one of the seals. It moved with a grace that belied its massive size, inching closer to its prey with infinite patience. She held her breath, torn between her growing bond with the bear and her sympathy for the unsuspecting seal. Just as the bear was about to pounce, a loud crack echoed across the ice. The seal, startled, quickly slipped into the water through a nearby breathing hole. The bear let out a frustrated growl, and Emily felt a pang of disappointment. She had been hoping that if the bear caught something, she might be able to scavenge some much-needed food. As if sensing her dismay, the bear turned and looked at her with those inscrutable dark eyes. Then, to Emily's amazement, it began to dig at the spot where the seal had disappeared. After a few moments, it unearthed something and nudged it towards her with its nose. Cautiously, Emily approached. There on the ice lay a small fish that the seal had apparently left behind in its hasty retreat. Her stomach growled loudly at the sight of potential food. Glancing at the bear, which had already turned its attention back to hunting, Emily gingerly picked up the fish. She knew she should cook it, but she had no means to make a fire. The gnawing hunger eventually won out over caution, and she bit into the raw flesh. The taste was strong and unpleasant, but it was the first real food she'd had in days. Emily forced herself to eat slowly, savoring each bite and trying not to think about what her parents would say if they could see her now. As she ate, Emily's mind wandered to Dr. Thompson and his experiment. She couldn't understand how anyone could be so cruel as to abandon a child in such a harsh environment. But then, looking at the bear that had unknowingly become her protector, she wondered if perhaps she was learning lessons that went beyond what Dr. Thompson had intended. Miles away, in his control room, Dr. Thompson was facing a crisis. The malfunctioning cameras had left large gaps in his surveillance, and he had lost track of Emily for extended periods. The experiment was slipping out of his control, and for the first time, real fear began to creep into his heart. "This wasn't supposed to happen," he muttered to himself, frantically scanning the video feeds. She was supposed to stay in the designated area. How did she get so far? As the reality of the situation began to sink in, Dr. Thompson realized he might need to end the experiment early, but that would mean admitting failure, jeopardizing years of research and potentially facing serious legal consequences. He pushed the thought aside, convincing himself that he just needed a little more time to regain control of the situation. Back on the ice, Emily had finished her meager meal and was once again following the bear. As they traveled, she began to notice more signs of life in the seemingly barren landscape. Arctic foxes darted between rocks, their white fur blending seamlessly with the snow. Overhead, seabirds wheeled and cried, their calls a stark contrast to the usual silence of the tundra. As the day wore on, Emily found herself growing more confident in her movements across the ice. She had learned to listen for the subtle creaks and groans that signaled dangerous thin spots, and to look for the slight color variations that indicated safer paths. The bear, for its part, seemed to have accepted Emily's presence. While it didn't actively acknowledge her most of the time, it also made no attempts to drive her away. There was an unspoken understanding between them, two creatures united by the common goal of survival in this unforgiving land. As the sun began its slow descent towards the horizon, Emily noticed the bear veering towards a large ice formation in the distance. As they drew closer, she realized it was a massive pressure ridge, a jumble of ice blocks pushed up by the movement of the pack ice. The bear began to climb the ridge, its powerful claws finding purchase on the slippery surface. Emily hesitated for a moment before following, her smaller hands and feet struggling to find handholds in the ice. It was slow going, and more than once she nearly lost her grip, her heart racing with each near slip. Finally, they reached the top of the ridge. Emily's breath caught in her throat at the view that greeted her. From this vantage point, she could see for miles in every direction. The setting sun painted the ice in shades of pink and gold, creating a breathtaking panorama that momentarily made her forget her dire situation. The bear settled down on a flat section of ice, apparently content to rest here for the night. Emily, exhausted from the climb, gladly followed suit. She curled up a short distance from the bear, using a small ice block as a windbreak. As she lay there watching the sky slowly darken, Emily found herself reflecting on how much she had changed in just a few short days. She was stronger now, both physically and mentally. She had learned to navigate this alien landscape, to find food and shelter where she thought none existed. For the first time since her ordeal began, Emily allowed herself to feel a glimmer of hope. If she could survive this long, maybe she could hold out until rescue came. And if rescue didn't come, well, she was learning to be self-sufficient in ways she never thought possible. As sleep began to overtake her, Emily's last conscious thought was of gratitude, for the bear that had become her unexpected guardian, and for the inner strength she never knew she possessed. Whatever tomorrow might bring, she would face it with the quiet determination she had learned from the ice. Little did Emily know that far away, events were unfolding that would soon change the course of her Arctic adventure. As she drifted off to sleep, Dr. Thompson was making a decision that would have far-reaching consequences for them both. The true test of Emily's newfound resilience was yet to come. The Arctic dawn broke over the pressure ridge, painting the ice in shades of lavender and gold. Emily stirred, her body stiff from another night spent on the unforgiving surface. She blinked, momentarily disoriented, before the reality of her situation came rushing back. The polar bear was already awake, its dark eyes scanning the horizon as if planning the day's journey. As Emily stretched and prepared for another day of survival, a new sound caught her attention. It was faint at first, barely audible over the ever-present Arctic wind, but as she strained her ears, the sound became clearer, a low, rhythmic thumping that seemed to echo across the ice. The bear had noticed it too. Its ears were pricked forward, head swiveling to locate the source of the noise. Emily's heart began to race. Could it be? After all this time, had rescue finally come? But as the sound grew louder, Emily realized it wasn't the thrum of helicopter blades as she'd first hoped. It was something else entirely, something that filled her with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. Over the horizon appeared a sight that took Emily's breath away. A small herd of muskoxen was making its way across the tundra, their shaggy forms a stark contrast to the white landscape. Emily had only ever seen these creatures in books or nature documentaries, and the sight of them in person was awe-inspiring. The bear, however, saw something else entirely, potential prey. It began to move towards the herd, its powerful form tense with anticipation. Emily hesitated, unsure whether to follow. She had grown accustomed to the bear's presence, but this was a stark reminder that it was still a wild predator. As the bear approached the herd, the muskoxen quickly formed a defensive circle, their young protected in the center. The standoff that ensued was like nothing Emily had ever witnessed. The bear circled the herd, looking for weakness, while the muskoxen stood their ground, their sharp horns a formidable defense. Suddenly, a commotion erupted on the far side of the herd. One of the younger muskoxen had panicked and broken away from the group. The bear, seizing its opportunity, gave chase. Emily watched, her heart in her throat, as predator and prey disappeared over a small rise. Minutes passed, feeling like hours to Emily. She debated whether to follow or stay put. Just as she had decided to investigate, the bear reappeared over the rise. To Emily's surprise, it hadn't caught the young muskox. Instead, it seemed to have given up the chase, perhaps realizing the energy expenditure wasn't worth it. As the bear made its way back to Emily, she noticed it was limping slightly. Had it been injured during the chase? Without thinking, Emily took a step towards the animal. concern overriding her usual caution. The bear paused, regarding her with what almost seemed like curiosity. For a long moment they stood there, girl and bear, each assessing the other. Then slowly, Emily extended her hand, palm out, in a gesture of peace. The bear sniffed the air, then, to Emily's amazement, took a step closer. Heart pounding, Emily remained still as the massive creature approached. She could feel its warm breath on her hand, see every detail of its thick white fur. Then gently, the bear pressed its nose against her palm. The contact lasted only a second, but to Emily, it felt like an eternity. In that moment, something shifted between them. They were no longer just two creatures happening to travel the same path. They had formed a connection, an unlikely alliance in this harsh world. As they set off again across the tundra, Emily found herself walking closer to the bear than ever before. She examined its injured paw as they walked, noticing a small cut that was causing the limp. If only she had some way to help, to repay the bear for its unintentional protection. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away, Dr. Thompson was facing a crisis of conscience. The loss of camera feeds had left him blind to Emily's whereabouts for days. Panic had set in, and he had finally made the decision to call in a search and rescue team. As he paced his control room, waiting for updates, Dr. Thompson grappled with the consequences of his actions. He had put a child's life at risk for the sake of his experiment. The data he had collected suddenly seemed insignificant in the face of what he stood to lose, not just his career, but his very freedom if the truth came to light. Back on the ice, Emily and the bear continued their journey. As they walked, Emily began to notice changes in the landscape. The endless white was gradually giving way to patches of exposed rock and sparse vegetation. They were nearing the edge of the tundra, where the frozen desert met the slightly more hospitable lands beyond. As they crested a small hill, Emily gasped at the sight before her. In the distance, she could see a thin column of smoke rising into the sky. Her heart leaped. Where there was smoke, there must be people. The bear, however, seemed wary of this new development. It hung back, reluctant to approach the sign of human presence. Emily found herself torn. The smoke represented her best chance of rescue, of returning to the world she knew. But the thought of leaving the bear, her protector and companion through this ordeal, filled her with an unexpected sadness. As she stood there, conflicted, a new sound reached her ears. It was distant but unmistakable, the bark of sled dogs. Someone was coming. Emily turned to the bear, tears welling in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered, knowing the animal couldn't understand her words but hoping it could sense her gratitude. The bear regarded her silently, its dark eyes unreadable. With a heavy heart, Emily began to move towards the sound of the dogs. She glanced back frequently, watching as the bear's form grew smaller in the distance. It stood there, a white sentinel against the vast tundra, until it was little more than a speck on the horizon. As Emily walked towards what she hoped was rescue, her mind was a whirlwind of emotions. Relief at the prospect of returning home warred with a newfound appreciation for the raw beauty and challenge of the Arctic. And underlying it all was a sense of profound change. She was not the same girl who had been left in the tundra days ago. Her experiences had transformed her, teaching her strength, resilience, and a deep respect for the natural world. The sound of the sled dogs grew louder, and soon Emily could make out figures on the horizon. As she waved her arms, calling out to attract their attention, she sent one last silent thanks to the bear that had been her unlikely guardian. Little did Emily know that her journey was far from over. The approaching rescue would bring with it new challenges and revelations that would test everything she had learned in the frozen wasteland. As the sled drew nearer, Emily squared her shoulders, ready to face whatever came next with the quiet strength she had discovered within herself. The sound of barking dogs grew louder, cutting through the crisp Arctic air. Emily's heart raced with a mixture of excitement and apprehension as the sled team came into view. She waved her arms frantically, her voice hoarse as she called out to attract their attention. The lead dog spotted her first, its howl alerting the rest of the team. The musher, a burly man bundled in thick furs, pulled the sled to a halt a short distance away. He approached Emily cautiously, his weathered face a mask of disbelief. "By God," he muttered, kneeling down to Emily's level. "Are you the girl? The one they've been searching for?" Emily nodded, tears of relief streaming down her face. "I'm Emily," she managed to choke out. "Dr. Thompson. He left me here." The musher's face darkened at the mention of Dr. Thompson's name. "I'm Jack," he said gently, wrapping a thick blanket around Emily's shoulders. "We've been looking for you for days. Let's get you somewhere warm and then we can talk." As Jack helped her onto the sled, Emily cast one last glance over her shoulder. In the distance, she thought she saw a flash of white, the polar bear watching from afar. But before she could be sure, the dogs were off, and the tundra became a blur of white and grey. The journey to the rescue camp was a haze for Emily. The warmth of the blanket, combined with the rhythmic motion of the sled, lulled her into a state of half-sleep. Images of her time in the tundra flashed through her mind. The endless ice, the polar bear's dark eyes, the muskoxen's defensive circle. When they arrived at the camp, Emily was immediately surrounded by a flurry of activity. Medics checked her vital signs, amazed at her relatively good condition given the ordeal she had endured. They marveled at how she had managed to survive in such a harsh environment with so few resources. As Emily sipped hot broth, warming her from the inside out, she overheard snippets of conversation between Jack and other members of the rescue team. They spoke in hushed tones, but words like unethical, lawsuit, and criminal charges floated on the air. A kind-faced woman named Sarah, who introduced herself as a child psychologist, sat down next to Emily. "You've been through quite an ordeal," she said gently. "Would you like to talk about it?" Emily hesitated, unsure where to begin. How could she explain the connection she had formed with the polar bear, the lessons she had learned from the ice itself? She feared they wouldn't understand, that they'd dismiss her experiences as the delusions of a traumatized child. I wasn't alone out there," Emily finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "There was a polar bear. It helped me." Sarah's eyebrows rose, but to her credit, she didn't dismiss Emily's words. "That must have been both frightening and amazing," she said. "Can you tell me more about it?" As Emily recounted her experiences, she was surprised to find the words flowing more easily. She described the bear's hunting techniques, how she had learned to read the ice, the encounter with the muskoxen. With each memory she shared, Emily felt a growing sense of pride in what she had accomplished. Sarah listened intently, occasionally jotting notes but mostly giving Emily her full attention. When Emily finished her story, Sarah smiled warmly. "You've shown incredible resilience, Emily. What you've been through, what you've learned, it's extraordinary." As night fell over the camp, Emily found herself unable to sleep despite her exhaustion. The soft bed felt strange after days of sleeping on ice, and the absence of the bear's steady breathing nearby was disorienting. She slipped out of her tent, wrapping herself in a blanket as she gazed up at the star-filled sky. To her surprise, she found Jack sitting by a small fire. He nodded to her, gesturing for her to join him. As Emily sat down, Jack spoke softly, his eyes on the flames. "You know, I've been running dogs up here for 30 years. Thought I'd seen everything the Arctic had to offer. But your story, it's something else." Emily hugged her knees to her chest, watching the fire dance. "Do you think anyone will believe me? About the bear?" Jack chuckled softly. "Kid, in the Arctic, stranger things have happened. I once saw a fox and a hare sharing a den during a blizzard. Nature has its own rules up here." They sat in companionable silence for a while, the crackling of the fire and the distant howl of the wind the only sounds. Finally, Jack spoke again. "They'll be flying you out tomorrow, back to civilization." Emily nodded, a lump forming in her throat. The prospect of returning home, which had seemed so desirable just days ago, now filled her with a strange sense of loss. "I don't know if I'm ready," she admitted. Jack regarded her thoughtfully. "The tundra changes you," he said. "It strips away everything but what's essential. You've seen a side of life few ever do. That's not something you just leave behind." As Emily mulled over Jack's words, a commotion arose from the other side of the camp. She could hear raised voices, one of which sounded distressingly familiar. Curious and a bit apprehensive, she rose to investigate, Jack following close behind. What she saw made her blood run cold. There, arguing heatedly with the rescue team leader, was Dr. Thompson. He looked disheveled, a far cry from the polished scientist who had left her in the tundra. When he spotted Emily, his eyes widened. "Emily," he called out, trying to push past the rescuers to reach her. "Thank goodness you're safe. I was so worried." "Stay back," Jack growled, stepping protectively in front of Emily. Dr. Thompson's face contorted with frustration. You don't understand. This was all part of the experiment, the data we've collected. Data. Emily found herself speaking, her voice stronger than she expected. Is that all I am to you? Data. The camp fell silent, all eyes on the small girl standing defiantly before the man who had put her through such an ordeal. In that moment, Emily felt the full weight of her experiences in the tundra. She was not the same scared, helpless child Dr. Thompson had abandoned days ago. I learned more out there than your experiment could ever teach, Emily continued, her voice steady. I learned about survival, about connection, about the real world. And I learned that sometimes the most important lessons come from the most unexpected teachers. As she spoke, Emily could almost swear she heard the distant roar of a polar bear carried on the wind. Whether real or imagined, it filled her with strength. She stood tall, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, knowing that she carried the spirit of the tundra within her. The confrontation with Dr. Thompson marked a turning point, not just for Emily, but for everyone involved in the rescue operation. As the night wore on, plans were made, decisions reached, and a new chapter in Emily's journey began to unfold, one that would test her newfound strength in ways she could never have imagined. The morning after the confrontation with Dr. Thompson dawned clear and cold. Emily stood at the edge of the camp, watching the sun rise over the tundra. The vast expanse of ice and snow that had been her home for days now seemed both familiar and alien. She took a deep breath, savoring the crisp Arctic air one last time before her departure. Behind her, the camp was a flurry of activity. The rescue team was preparing for the arrival of the helicopter that would take Emily back to civilization. But amidst the bustle, there was an undercurrent of tension. Dr. Thompson's unexpected appearance had thrown everyone off balance, and heated discussions could be heard from the command tent. Sarah, the child psychologist, approached Emily with a gentle smile. "How are you feeling this morning?" she asked, her voice filled with genuine concern. Emily considered the question carefully. "Different," she finally replied. Like I'm not the same person who came here." Sarah nodded understandingly. "That's to be expected after what you've been through. But remember, Emily, different doesn't mean worse. You've shown incredible strength and resilience." As they talked, Jack emerged from the command tent, his face grave. He made his way over to Emily and Sarah, his steps heavy. "There's been a change of plans," he said, his voice low. "The authorities want to question Dr. Thompson about his experiment. They're sending a separate team to handle that." But he hesitated, looking at Emily with concern. "They also want to talk to you, Emily, to hear your side of the story." Emily felt a knot form in her stomach. The thought of reliving her ordeal, of having to explain her experiences to strangers who couldn't possibly understand, was daunting. But then she remembered the polar bear, its quiet strength and determination. She straightened her shoulders and nodded. "I'll talk to them," she said firmly. "They need to know what really happened out there." Jack smiled, a hint of pride in his eyes. "That's brave of you, kid. But don't worry, you won't be alone. Sarah and I will be with you every step of the way." As the morning wore on, the distant thrum of helicopter blades signaled the arrival of the authorities. Emily watched as a group of serious-looking men and women in dark suits disembarked, their eyes scanning the camp. One of them, a tall woman with kind eyes, approached Emily. "Hello, Emily," she said, her voice gentle but authoritative. "I'm Agent Carter. We'd like to ask you a few questions about your time here, if that's okay." Emily nodded, feeling Sarah's reassuring hand on her shoulder. They made their way to a quiet corner of the camp, where Agent Carter began to ask her questions. At first, Emily's responses were hesitant, but as she spoke about her experiences, the challenges she faced, the lessons she learned, and yes, the polar bear that had become her unlikely guardian, her voice grew stronger. To her surprise, Agent Carter listened intently, never dismissing her story or treating her like a child who didn't understand what had happened. When Emily finished, the agent leaned back, a thoughtful expression on her face. "Thank you, Emily," she said. "Your account is going to be very important in understanding what happened here. You've shown remarkable courage and resourcefulness." As Agent Carter stood to leave, Emily found herself asking a question that had been nagging at her. "What's going to happen to Dr. Thompson?" The agent's expression turned serious. "That's still being determined. What he did was very wrong, Emily. But thanks to your testimony, We can make sure nothing like this ever happens again." Throughout the day, Emily watched as the authorities interviewed other members of the rescue team. Dr. Thompson was kept separate, under guard in one of the tents. Emily caught glimpses of him occasionally, looking disheveled and defeated. Despite everything he had put her through, she found herself feeling a complicated mix of emotions towards him. Anger, certainly, but also a strange sort of pity. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the tundra, Jack approached Emily with news. "They're ready to fly you out," he said. "Your parents are waiting for you at the hospital in Anchorage." Emily felt a surge of emotion at the mention of her parents. After everything she had been through, the thought of seeing them again was overwhelming. But as she looked out over the tundra one last time, she felt a pang of something like homesickness. "I know it sounds crazy," she said softly, "but part of me doesn't want to leave. I feel like I'm leaving a piece of myself behind." Jack nodded understandingly. "The Arctic has a way of getting into your soul," he said. "But you're not leaving it behind, Emily. You're taking it with you. The strength you found here, the lessons you learned, they're a part of you now." As Emily boarded the helicopter, she took one last look at the vast expanse of ice and snow. For a moment, she thought she saw a flash of white in the distance. Her polar bear, watching over her one last time. Whether it was real or just her imagination, it filled her with a sense of peace. The helicopter lifted off, the wind whipping around them as they rose into the air. Emily pressed her face against the window, watching as the tundra grew smaller beneath them. But even as the landscape faded from view, she could feel its presence within her, a wellspring of strength and resilience that would stay with her always. As they flew towards Anchorage and the reunion with her parents, Emily knew that her journey was far from over. The experiences she had in the tundra had changed her in profound ways, and integrating those changes into her old life would be a challenge all its own. But as she thought about the bear, about the lessons of survival and connection she had learned, she felt ready to face whatever lay ahead. The helicopter flew on through the gathering darkness, carrying Emily towards a future that was at once familiar and utterly new. Behind her, the tundra stretched on, vast and eternal, its secrets and wisdom etched forever in her heart. The lights of Anchorage twinkled below as the helicopter descended towards the city. Emily's heart raced, a mix of excitement and anxiety coursing through her veins. After days in the vast emptiness of the tundra, the sight of civilization was almost overwhelming. As they touched down on the hospital helipad, Emily saw two figures rushing towards the helicopter. Even in the dim evening light, she recognized them immediately, her parents. The moment the door opened, she was enveloped in their embrace, their tears mingling with her own. "Oh, Emily," her mother sobbed, holding her tightly. "We were so worried. We thought we'd lost you." Her father, usually so composed, was openly weeping. "You're safe now," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "You're home." But even as Emily reveled in the warmth and safety of her parents' arms, a small part of her felt different. The girl who had left home days ago was not the same one who had returned. The tundra had changed her in ways her parents couldn't yet understand. The next few days passed in a whirlwind of medical checkups, debriefings and reunions with worried family members. Emily found herself struggling to articulate her experiences. How could she explain the profound connection she had felt with the polar bear, the lessons she had learned from the ice itself, the strength she had discovered within herself? Her parents, though overjoyed at her safe return, were clearly struggling to comprehend what she had been through. They hovered anxiously, as if afraid she might disappear again if they took their eyes off her for even a moment. It was during one of her sessions with a child psychologist that Emily finally found the words to express her feelings. "I'm not the same," she said quietly, twisting the hem of her shirt in her fingers. "The tundra, it changed me, and I don't know how to be the old Emily anymore." The psychologist, Dr. Larson, nodded understandingly. "What you went through was extraordinary, Emily. It's natural that it would have a profound impact on you. The key is to integrate those experiences into your life moving forward." As the days turned into weeks, Emily slowly began to adjust to life back in civilization. But she found herself constantly comparing her surroundings to the stark beauty of the tundra. The busy streets felt claustrophobic after the vast open spaces of the Arctic. The constant noise of the city grated on her nerves, making her long for the profound silence of the ice fields. At school, Emily struggled to connect with her old friends. Their concerns about homework and social drama seemed trivial compared to the life and death challenges she had faced. She found herself drawn instead to the quiet corners of the library, poring over books about Arctic wildlife and Inuit culture. One day, as she was reading about polar bear behavior, a classmate approached her table. "You're that girl, aren't you?" he asked hesitantly. "The one who survived in the Arctic?" Emily nodded, bracing herself for the usual barrage of questions about how scary it had been or if she had seen any polar bears. But the boy surprised her. "That must have been amazing," he said, his eyes wide with genuine interest. "What was it like? I mean, really like?" For the first time since her return, Emily felt a spark of excitement as she began to share her experiences. She told him about the ever-changing colors of the tundra, the way the ice seemed alive beneath her feet, the lessons she had learned about resilience and adaptability. As she spoke, she realized that her experiences weren't just something that had happened to her. They were a part of her now, a source of strength and wisdom that she could draw upon. This realization marked a turning point for Emily. She began to find ways to incorporate the lessons of the tundra into her daily life. She started a nature club at school, teaching her classmates about Arctic ecosystems and the importance of environmental conservation. She volunteered at the local wildlife rescue center, feeling a special connection to the animals in their care. At home, Emily worked on helping her parents understand her transformation. She showed them the sketches she had made of the tundra landscapes, told them stories about the polar bear that had been her silent guardian. Slowly, they began to see that while the ordeal had been traumatic, it had also given their daughter gifts of strength and perspective that were truly precious. One evening, as the family sat together watching a documentary about Arctic wildlife, Emily's father turned to her with a thoughtful expression. "You know, Em," he said softly, "I think I'm finally starting to understand. What you went through, it wasn't just about survival. It was about finding a part of yourself you never knew existed." Emily nodded, feeling a lump form in her throat. "I miss it sometimes," she admitted. "The tundra. It was beautiful in a way that's hard to explain. And the bear." She trailed off, lost in memories. Her mother reached out and squeezed her hand. "Maybe someday we can go back," she suggested. "Not to relive what happened, but to see it through your eyes. To understand the place that's become such an important part of you." The idea took root, growing stronger as the weeks passed. Emily threw herself into research, learning everything she could about responsible Arctic tourism and wildlife conservation efforts in the region. She began to dream of a future where she could bridge the gap between her two worlds, the comfortable familiarity of her home and the wild, transformative power of the tundra. As spring turned to summer, Emily received news that both excited and unsettled her. Dr. Thompson's trial was approaching, and she had been asked to testify about her experiences. The prospect of facing the man who had put her through such an ordeal was daunting, but Emily knew it was an important step in her journey. As she prepared for the trial, Emily drew strength from the memories of her time in the tundra. She remembered the quiet determination of the polar bear, the resilience of the Arctic flora that bloomed in the harshest conditions. She knew that, like them, she had the strength to face this challenge. The night before the trial, Emily stood at her bedroom window, gazing up at the stars. Though the city lights obscured many of them, she could still make out a few bright points in the darkness. She thought of the vast star-filled sky over the tundra and felt a sense of connection to that distant place. "I'm ready," she whispered to herself, a quiet determination in her voice. Whatever the trial might bring, whatever challenges lay ahead, Emily knew she would face them with the strength and wisdom she had gained in the frozen heart of the Arctic. As she turned away from the window, ready to face the next chapter of her journey, Emily carried with her the spirit of the tundra, wild, beautiful, and unbreakable. The courthouse loomed before Emily, its imposing facade a stark contrast to the open expanses of the tundra she still dreamed about. She took a deep breath, feeling the reassuring presence of her parents on either side of her as they climbed the steps. Inside, the air was thick with tension. Emily's eyes darted around the crowded courtroom, taking in the sea of unfamiliar faces. Journalists scribbled furiously in their notepads, their eyes hungry for the story of the girl who survived the Arctic. In the front row, she spotted Jack and Sarah from the rescue team, offering encouraging smiles. And then she saw him. Dr. Thompson sat at the defense table, his once pristine suit now rumpled, his face haggard. Their eyes met for a brief moment, and Emily was surprised to see not defiance but a flicker of something that looked almost like remorse. As the trial began, Emily listened to the prosecution lay out the case against Dr. Thompson. They spoke of reckless endangerment, of unethical experimentation, of a man so consumed by his quest for knowledge that he lost sight of basic human decency. With each word, Emily felt the weight of her experiences pressing down on her. When it was her turn to testify, Emily approached the witness stand with trepidation. But as she settled into the chair and looked out over the courtroom, a strange calm came over her. She thought of the polar bear, of its quiet strength and dignity in the face of the harsh Arctic environment. Drawing on that memory, Emily began to speak. She told the court about the fear and confusion of those first moments in the tundra, the biting cold and the overwhelming silence. But then her voice grew stronger as she described her journey of survival and self-discovery. She spoke of the lessons learned from the ice and snow, of the unexpected alliance with the polar bear, and of the strength she found within herself. Dr. Thompson's experiment was wrong, Emily said, her voice clear and steady. He put my life at risk, but the Arctic itself, it taught me things I never could have learned any other way. It showed me a part of myself I didn't know existed. As she spoke, Emily noticed a change come over Dr. Thompson. The man who had once seemed so cold and calculating now looked shaken, his eyes wide as he listened to her testimony. When the defense attorney cross-examined her, trying to poke holes in her story or suggest that her memories were confused, Emily stood firm. She answered each question thoughtfully, drawing on the clarity and focus she had developed in the tundra. "No, sir," she said in response to one particularly pointed question. "I'm not confused about what happened. The Arctic strips away everything but what's essential. My memories of that time are clearer than anything I've ever experienced." As Emily stepped down from the witness stand, she felt a sense of release. She had spoken her truth, had given voice to the experiences that had transformed her. Whatever the outcome of the trial, she knew she had done what was right. The trial continued for several more days, with expert witnesses testifying about the dangers of the experiment and the potential psychological impact on Emily. Through it all, Emily sat with her parents, listening intently and occasionally whispering clarifications or observations. On the final day of the trial, just before the jury was set to deliberate, Dr. Thompson surprised everyone by asking to address the court. As he stood, Emily felt a mix of emotions, anger, curiosity, and an unexpected twinge of sympathy. I made a terrible mistake," Dr. Thompson began, his voice barely above a whisper. "In my pursuit of knowledge, I lost sight of the most important thing, the well-being of a child entrusted to my care." He turned to face Emily directly. "Emily, I can never undo what I put you through, but I want you to know that your courage, your resilience, it's shown me the error of my ways in a way that no scientific data ever could." As Dr. Thompson spoke, Emily felt a shift in the atmosphere of the courtroom. The anger and judgment that had permeated the proceedings began to give way to something more complex, a recognition of human fallibility and the potential for growth and change. When the jury returned with their verdict, finding Dr. Thompson guilty on several counts, Emily felt a mix of vindication and sadness. As the judge announced that part of Dr. Thompson's sentence would include funding for Arctic wildlife conservation and education programs, Emily allowed herself a small smile. Perhaps some good could come from this ordeal after all. As they left the courthouse, Emily was surprised to find a crowd of reporters and well-wishers waiting. But instead of feeling overwhelmed, she felt a surge of confidence. This was an opportunity to share the lessons she had learned, to help others understand the beauty and importance of the Arctic ecosystem. Stepping up to the microphones, Emily began to speak. She talked about resilience and adaptation, about the delicate balance of life in the tundra, and about the need to protect these vulnerable environments. As she spoke, she saw heads nodding, saw people listening with genuine interest and concern. That evening, as Emily sat with her parents watching the news coverage of the trial, she felt a sense of closure. The ordeal that had begun in the frozen wasteland of the Arctic had come full circle, but it wasn't an ending. It was a beginning. "Mom, Dad," she said, turning to her parents with determination in her eyes. "I know what I want to do with my life. I want to study environmental science. I want to go back to the Arctic, not as a victim or a subject of an experiment, but as a researcher, a protector." Her parents exchanged a look, a mix of pride and apprehension in their eyes, but they nodded, understanding that their daughter had found her calling. As Emily drifted off to sleep that night, her dreams were filled not with the terror of her ordeal, but with visions of vast ice fields, of polar bears moving silently through the snow, of a future dedicated to preserving and understanding the wild beauty of the Arctic. The tundra had changed her, had shown her a path forward, and Emily was ready to embrace it, to let the lessons of the ice guide her towards a future full of purpose and possibility. 10 years had passed since Emily's harrowing experience in the Arctic tundra. The young girl who had once been abandoned in the frozen wasteland had grown into a confident and passionate young woman. Now, at 29, Dr. Emily Carter stood at the bow of a research vessel, her eyes fixed on the horizon where the midnight sun hung low, casting a golden glow across the sea ice. Emily took a deep breath, savoring the crisp Arctic air. It felt like coming home. After years of study and hard work, she had finally returned to the place that had shaped her so profoundly. But this time, she wasn't a scared child fighting for survival. She was a respected environmental scientist, leading an expedition to study the impacts of climate change on Arctic ecosystems. As the ship navigated through the ice-strewn waters, Emily's mind wandered back to the journey that had brought her here. The years following the trial had been filled with intense focus and determination. She had thrown herself into her studies, excelling in environmental science and Arctic biology. Her unique perspective, born from her experiences in the tundra, had given her insights that her professors found invaluable. Throughout her academic career, Emily had never lost sight of her goal. She had interned on Arctic research expeditions, networked with leading scientists in the field, and eventually earned her PhD with a groundbreaking thesis on polar bear adaptation to changing sea ice conditions. Now, as the leader of her own research team, Emily felt a sense of purpose stronger than ever before. Her expedition wasn't just about collecting data or publishing papers. It was about protecting the delicate balance of life in the Arctic, about ensuring that future generations would have the chance to experience the raw beauty and power of this unique environment. As the ship approached their research site, Emily gathered her team for a briefing. Looking at their eager faces, she saw reflections of her younger self, the curiosity, the passion, the desire to make a difference. She felt a surge of pride and responsibility. "Remember," she told them, her voice carrying over the hum of the ship's engines, "we're not just here to observe. We're here to understand, to connect, to become part of the Arctic story. Every piece of data we collect, every observation we make, brings us one step closer to preserving this incredible ecosystem." Over the next few weeks, Emily and her team worked tirelessly. They collected ice core samples, tracked animal migration patterns, and monitored changes in the permafrost. Emily found herself constantly amazed by the resilience of Arctic life, the way plants and animals adapted to the harsh conditions and changing climate. One evening, as the team was setting up camp on a stretch of tundra, Emily wandered a short distance from the group. As she crested a small rise, her breath caught in her throat. There, not 50 yards away, stood a polar bear. For a moment, time seemed to stand still as their eyes met. In that instant, Emily was transported back to her childhood, to the bear that had been her silent guardian during those terrifying days alone in the tundra. This bear was different, of course, but the connection she felt was just as powerful. As the bear ambled away, disappearing into the lengthening shadows, Emily felt a renewed sense of purpose. She understood, more clearly than ever, that her work wasn't just about scientific data. It was about preserving the magic and mystery of the Arctic, about ensuring that future generations would have the chance to experience moments like this. Returning to camp, Emily shared the encounter with her team. As they sat around the campfire, she found herself opening up about her childhood experience in a way she never had before. She told them about the fear, yes, but also about the profound connection she had felt with the land and its creatures. Her team listened in rapt silence, and Emily could see in their eyes a new understanding dawning. They weren't just scientists collecting data, they were guardians of a precious and vulnerable world. As their expedition neared its end, Emily's team had made several important discoveries. Their research provided new insights into the rate of sea ice decline and its impact on wildlife populations. But perhaps more importantly, they had forged a deep personal connection with the Arctic landscape. On their final night in the field, Emily stood alone at the edge of camp, gazing out over the tundra. The midnight sun painted the landscape in hues of gold and pink, the light reflecting off patches of snow and ice. In the distance, she could hear the haunting call of a snowy owl. In that moment, Emily felt a profound sense of peace and belonging. She had come full circle, returning to the place that had once terrified her as a child, but now she understood that the Arctic had never been her enemy. It had been her teacher, her inspiration, and ultimately, her calling. As she turned to rejoin her team, Emily silently renewed her commitment to protecting this fragile and beautiful world. She knew the challenges ahead were immense. Climate change, resource exploitation, and human encroachment all threatened the Arctic's delicate balance. But she also knew that with dedication, education, and a deep connection to the land, there was hope. Emily's journey had started as a tale of survival against the odds. But it had become something much more, a story of transformation, of finding one's purpose, and of the enduring power of the human spirit when connected to the natural world. As the research vessel began its journey south the next day, Emily stood at the rail watching the Arctic landscape recede into the distance, but she knew this wasn't goodbye. The call of the Arctic was a part of her now, a constant whisper in her heart urging her to continue her work, to keep exploring, to keep protecting. The tundra had changed her, had shown her a path, and Emily was ready to follow that path wherever it might lead, carrying with her always the quiet strength and wild beauty of the frozen north.